Okay, we're going to go ahead and get ourselves moving on to the next presentation. So if you haven't already jotted down on the card the answer to the question, what does uncertainty mean to me? Please finalize that. Then we'll walk around and collect those cards from you all. And like I said, I'll compile them really quickly and we'll report back. We'll be here. It's been quite fascinating to be at each one of the four sessions and see where common themes and then some unique things pop out at each workshop. So that's been really interesting. So Perrette and others are gathering around. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand things over to Abby Ostovar from Montgomery and Associates.
Thank you very much. Okay, it's my pleasure to give you an overview of the Salinas Valley. So for those of you who have been involved in Groundwater Sustainability Agency or Monterey County Water Resources Agency meetings, you probably have a much deeper depth of knowledge than I'm going to go into today. But we really wanted to make sure that everybody has a basic understanding of water in the Salinas Valley, just so that we can start talking about some of those actions we can take in the future. So here is a map of the Salinas Valley. Some of you may be map people, others of you might not be. Let me point out a couple things on here just to acquaint you with where we are. So let's see. So here's the county line at the bottom, and the black line around here is the groundwater basin as defined by the Department of Water Resources. We are up here in the city of Salinas. We've got Castroville, Marina, Seaside, the peninsula. We've got, Gonzales there, Soledad, Greenfield, King City. So you can see several of the cities there. And down here at the bottom, you'll notice we have Lake San Antonio and Lake Nacimiento. Those are the two reservoirs that the Water Resource Agency has that really recharge the water within the valley. They come down, meet the Salinas River, and then also the Arroyo Seco is one of the main tributaries coming to the Salinas River, which flows northward out to the Monterey Bay. This is a topographic map, so the colors are roughly the elevation, the ground elevation, not really telling you anything about the groundwater basin per se. But you can see that we've got the Sierra de Salinas that rises up on the west, and we've got the Gablin Range on the right. So as you're driving down the valley, you kind of see mountains rising to each side. Those are what those two mountain ranges are. And then the green area on the valley floor, most of this is irrigated agriculture. If you've lived here for a while, you've probably noticed the strawberry fields, lettuce fields, vineyards around. We have a huge agricultural production here. Here's one example of some vineyards here. And then up by Moss Landing, we also have some estuary area there too. So I'm going to talk mainly just about the valley as a whole. It is one connected groundwater basin. There are 6 sub-basins within the Salinas Valley that Dave talked about earlier, ways that we've divided how to work on more specific areas of the valley. And there's also, I guess I should say, there is a 7th within Monterey County, which is Seaside, that is adjudicated, so that's not one of the Salinas Valley Basin Groundwater Sustainability Agency areas. And we have 2 partner groundwater sustainability agencies also that we work with very closely, Marina Coast Water District and the Arroyo Seco GSA. But as a whole, I'm generally going to be talking about Salinas Valley as a valley. There's a map over there if you're curious to dig down into the details, and there's a lot of meetings if you want to know more about the details. You can double back with later. So generally, water use underpins the economy here. We are very dependent on groundwater. This is an agricultural valley. Almost $5 billion in direct economic outputs come from agriculture. And that's not all. That has ripple effects in the economy because that money is then respent on many goods and services within the county. So it contributes about 12 billion or almost 12 billion. And these are 2018 numbers from the Farm Bureau. So with the recent inflation, it's probably much more. But that's huge, right? That's a huge amount that it contributes to our communities. And that's both in terms of economic output, but also the jobs. 1 in 5 jobs in Monterey County come from agriculture, most of those from the Salinas Valley. And agriculture uses 91% of the water. We couldn't have that agriculture without having irrigation, without having a water supply. Up here, you can just see a general breakdown to get an idea of the water use and type. You see the 91%, the blue on the top, is the water that agricultural uses out of the total water use within the Salinas Valley. Urban accounts for about 9%, and rural domestic is that tiny sliver of 0.2%, those individual households throughout the county. In terms of the type, 96% of the water use comes from groundwater, only 1% from surface, and then 3% from recycled water. Now, I should note, groundwater and surface water, of course, are part of an overall water system. So I mentioned the water from the reservoirs recharges the groundwater basin. It's also directed to be used in certain areas in lieu of groundwater. So they're both very important together, but most people are getting their water out of wells that are in the ground. Here you can see the breakdown, important to all different sectors. So we've got 96% of urban use depends on groundwater. All of the rural residential relies on groundwater. And then agriculture relies on groundwater by 96%. There are also environmental uses, ecosystems. Those we don't have a quantification for, but do want to note that that is an important use of groundwater too. So what has all this groundwater use done? Over the past century, as we pump more out of the ground, there's been a number of challenges that it's led to. Number one, we've had groundwater level decline. As you're pumping water out of the ground, if you pump more than it's recharged into the groundwater level declines. That's led to an overall loss in storage across the valley as a whole. And in the coastal areas where we've got the ocean, as we've lowered that groundwater level, lower than sea level, groundwater has intruded into the upper two most aquifers, seawater intrusion. We've also had other water issues, namely the flooding along the Salinas River, right? So this is actually from 1969. In a few minutes, I'll show you last year's flooding, also very extensive along the Salinas River. So just to dig in just a little deeper, just to make sure everybody understands kind of the ramifications of groundwater level decline. Here is 2022. So go back in your memory before all those winter storms. We had three consecutive dry years, and 2022 was the third of the consecutive dry years. The GSA partners with Monterey County Water Resources Agency, who monitors groundwater levels across this area, and these are the monitoring wells set up there. And the red dots are the wells with critically low groundwater levels. The yellow are the wells with low groundwater levels, and the green are what we want. Those are the sustainable groundwater levels. So this gives you a kind of snapshot of the valley at the end of those three consecutive dry years, right? So we see a lot of red dots, some throughout the valley, a lot in the northern part, and then only a couple green dots and numerous yellow dots, right? So we had a lot of critically low groundwater levels. And when we mean critically low, generally we benchmark that to the 2015, 2016 drought, because that's what, as we talk to folks in the beginning of the GSA, people defined as that was an area that we don't want to go. We don't want to have those groundwater levels again. That's too much for us. We need to do something at that point. So then we had the big storms. So this is a picture of the flooding from 2023. We had a storm that ended December, January, again in March, right? Along the Salinas River, it took out numerous agricultural acres, right? Flooding. So what did that do for groundwater levels? This is the change from fall to fall. So just before I dig into the colors, generally we have a wet and dry season here. And so in the beginning of the year, we get all the rain, we get, recharge along the valley. And then as we get into the summer, precipitation slows down. We have a lot of agricultural pumping for irrigation. So that's kind of the time of the year when groundwater levels are lowest. And then fall is when we consider that the groundwater levels are kind of neutral. They've come up after that pumping, but it's before you get that influx of rain. So if you're trying to look at generally how are we doing, we tend to look at fall. So fall 2022, that end of the three consecutive dry years, to fall 2023, after the wet rains, the pumping of that year, and groundwater levels coming back up. This is that change. And so the blue colors and even dark purple, those are the colors where groundwater levels have increased. And you can see the more prominent the purple dark color is, the more it's increased, up to over 20 feet. The yellows and the hotter colors get into areas that it still had decline, even though we had that really wet year. So you can see, especially in the northern part of the basin, we had some yellows, oranges, and even reds of declines of more than 20 feet. I will say there's a few yellow dots in the southern part. That's in large part not that they didn't get recharged, but that they were actually fine at the end of 2022, and so there wasn't much higher that their groundwater levels would go. So increases in many wells. The wet year was super helpful. but not everywhere, not in all wells and in all aquifers. So comparing just the same snapshot to before, and sorry, this is a little bit small. The presentations are on the GSA website if you want to look at them more in depth. But this has the red, yellow, green scheme as before, 2022 on the left, 2023 on the right. And you can see, yep, definitely fewer red dots, fewer of those critically low groundwater levels, but still some of them, right? Especially in the northern part of the valley. And definitely more green dots as well. So it did help, but it didn't help get us back to the levels that we want to be at, back to those sustainable groundwater levels. So what does that mean in terms of groundwater storage, that amount of groundwater in the ground? We never really measure how much groundwater there is because it's not all accessible. You can't suck every single water molecule out of the ground. And we have those negative effects, subsidence, seawater intrusion, dry wells, water quality issues. We tend to see those as groundwater levels decline. So that's not related to overall, are there more water droplets down there? It's are those levels declining over time? And those levels declining over time indicate that the groundwater in storage is declining. So I think this is one of the few snapshots that I have that breaks down the valley a bit. For those of you who have followed the Water Resource Agency, this is similar to what they've done except for the GSA subbasins. And this takes those monitoring wells in each area of the valley and brings them together, so it averages them in each of the areas, and looks at what has the change been from 1945 to where we are after the 2023 fall measurement. And you can see overall, there's been this decline. And this is a cumulative change in groundwater storage. The cumulative change in groundwater level plots look very similar because we developed the storage one off of the groundwater level one. The difference is that different parts of the valley, the groundwater level change accounts for a different amount of a change in storage based on how much that groundwater basin can hold at that point or that area. So in terms of storage, we've seen this decline over time in several of the areas. We also see some areas like the green and the orange at the top that really have hovered up towards the top, that haven't declined, but all of them, those included, have these big dips down during drought. So this is in the 1990s. Again, this is the 2015, 2016 drought. And then we're getting pretty low actually in 2022. And then I don't know if you can squint and see it, but 2023, a number of those shot back up. And so when there's less groundwater in storage, that means less water supply for municipal and agricultural use, and also a risk of some of those bigger challenges of seawater intrusion, subsidence, dry wells. So we can see that droughts really do exacerbate the conditions here. So in terms of seawater intrusion, I'll get to a map in a minute. You can actually, since we are in Salinas, you can see a little schematic of Salinas. This is just to give you an idea of what the groundwater basin looks like. So the reservoirs are off the map over on the right. And you can see that there's one main aquifer system, and as it comes down closer to the coast, it fans out into this layered aquifer system where you have an aquitard, which is a bunch of clay that really prevent a lot of movement across that clay, so you don't really get groundwater recharging there. And then you have an aquifer, aquitard, and then these deep aquifers. And in the upper two aquifers along the coast, the 180-foot and the 400-foot aquifers, we've seen seawater intrusion and have since the 1940s. So as we've lowered groundwater levels, seawater intrusion has been one of the main things that the valley has tried to tackle, and has done a great job. The Water Resource Agency started to measure this back in the 1940s. Part of the reason they developed the two reservoirs to be able to regulate when water flows down the river, right? And help mitigate flooding as well. In 1998, the Castroville Seawater Intrusion Project came online that took recycled water and sent it over to this Castroville Seawater Intrusion Project area. If you've seen those purple pipes out there, that's delivering that water. In 2010, the Water Resource Agency also redid how they released from the reservoirs and diverted additional surface water to go to that area as well. So where we have seawater intrusion underneath, they're helping to deliver an alternative supply. So we've done a lot, right? The valley has come together multiple times in the past to be able to tackle these water issues. And it's helped. It's definitely helped. So this is on the left is showing the rate of seawater intrusion in terms of how much land area underneath is intruded. And you can see it's 1944 to 2023. And you can see that the rate was jumping up. And those two lines are 1998 and 2010, when the recycled water and then surface water came online for CSIP. And you can see that that rate of intrusion has slowed significantly. But it's still going up. So it's helping a lot, but it's not quite enough. In terms of where it is on the map, the purple is that uppermost aquifer, the 180-foot aquifer. So you can see here, we've got Castroville, Salinas, it's edging right towards City of Marina. And then this area here is the CSIP area. And then the 400-foot aquifer is this red line here, or the area that's intruded in the 400-foot aquifer. And so you can see that it's a little bit closer to the coast, but then we also had an island where seawater intrusion in the 180 went down to the 400-foot aquifer. So seawater intrusion is threatening both the agricultural supplies, particularly where CSIP is not present, as well as drinking water supplies in this region. Those are just a couple of the challenges. There are a number of other ones. So I mentioned dry wells. It tends to be that individual domestic wells, small systems, have shallower wells than the main production wells, the main municipal and agricultural production wells. So as groundwater levels decline, those shallower wells no longer have access to water, right? We also see contamination. A number of constituents, but nitrate is one of the main ones that we see being mobilized and affecting drinking water systems. We have arsenic, so especially up by Prunedale or down by the El Toro area, we have that naturally occurring arsenic. It's part of that granite bedrock, that when you have groundwater sitting with that granite bedrock for centuries, it kind of gets some of that arsenic in there, and it's really harmful to humans. And then environmental habitat degradation. As I mentioned, there are areas, there are ecosystems where groundwater levels are high enough, and the ecosystems depend on that groundwater. And so if you lower those groundwater levels deeper than where roots can reach, it can harm those ecosystems. So what does that indicate? Where are we? We have some larger issues that we've started to tackle, but still have work to do on. One of the biggest things, though, is not just that we have chronic declines in groundwater levels in some areas, but we have these uncertainties, right? We have these floods, we have these droughts, we have back and forth conditions, and you don't know what you're going to have the next year. If we had just taken the snapshot at the end of 2022, we were about halfway down towards where we were in 2015. What if we'd had another dry year at that point, right? I mean, luckily we got all that rain, but it's really, really hard to plan for that uncertainty. And we also see that it's not just droughts. I mean, droughts, we feel that pinch, but the floods had huge economic repercussions for agriculture, right? So this back and forth means that our water management is really trying to do this dance and really trying to tackle both of those without really knowing what those conditions will be. Now, Water Resource Agency has some tools. Those reservoirs do help us bridge year to year. But as we're seeing the fluctuations grow and be multi-year droughts, for example, that's really, really hard to tackle. So we need to figure out how to manage and plan for uncertainty and these extremes, in addition to overall raising groundwater levels in some areas. So how can this be done? There are a number of different actions, and there are groundwater sustainability plans for each subbasin that lay out a variety of options. The groundwater sustainability agencies have a number of different projects in the works and feasibility studies to look at, okay, which of these would be the best option? You know, they're having thoughtful dialogues about what the community wants, what approach they want to take. And generally, we have kind of two main buckets of actions. I'm going to set aside seawater intrusion for a minute. It's a little bit trickier in how you tackle it, and there's a few different options. There are feasibility studies underway specific to seawater intrusion, and one aspect of it does relate to groundwater levels. As I mentioned, when you pump a lot more than is recharged, and groundwater levels drop, seawater can intrude, right, if there's a pathway of intrusion. So that's one set, and we're going to set that aside for today. Increasing recharge is putting more in. So generally, you can take less out, so reduce the amount of pumping, or you can put more in. And that's recharge that can either occur where there's no aquitard, kind of naturally into the ground, or where you have an aquitard that's preventing water from coming from the surface, you need to inject water down in. So generally, those are your two mechanisms. And there's many different projects, many different ways to go about doing that. And there are a number of feasibility studies and things underway to look at putting more in the ground, doing aquifer storage and recovery, for example. And so those are in the works. But the taking less out, that is a big, scary elephant in the room. And that's part of the reason we wanted to bring it here. When the Sustainable Groundwater Management came out in California, I think the way that people were talking about what this would do and how it'd move forward was, okay, we need to figure out how much there is and divide it up among everybody and have what a lot of people called allocation, right? That is scary. That is incredibly scary because we depend on water for drinking water, for our economy. You know, the thought of changing that is a really scary conversation, right? And as we've been thinking about this more and more, I thought, well, actually, there's many different ways you can get at this. And a lot of them are being tackled and have been tackled. So why are we just talking about it in this one way, right? And so part of what these conversations are, as Dave noted, is to back up, say, wait, that's one way to do it. But there's a number of other things that could help overall reduce pumping, right? And so here we're trying to open the conversation. Later I'll share what some different options are. We'll be talking about it more. But I want to just preface this with, we know, and we are working on the recharge side of things and the seawater intrusion side of things. We're not negating that. It's just that this conversation is more focused on the how do we take less out side of things. Okay, are there questions?
We've got a couple of mics here. Like I said, if you've been jotting questions down on cards, we're happy to grab them. Got another mic if I can get some help to run the mic around. So are there any questions that folks have for Abby? No? Oh, yep, Bill, go ahead. All right. Well, here, you're going to need to answer it.
Okay.
So. Why did the language change from earlier workshops to later workshops regarding the Salinas Valley as a bathtub? And was the shift intended to promote a narrative of collective responsibility rather than individual accountability for undesirable results like seawater intrusion?
Did I change how I talked about this?
You could blame Derek because Derek may have used it. Because Derek had done the first presentation at the first workshop that Bill.
Sure.
And yesterday you said it was a bathtub, but a very complicated one.
Okay. Okay.
It's got water coming in.
No. And not necessarily a conscious change. So this is really good to bring out, but it's something that I didn't highlight here. So
Wait, I don't think your mic. You got to move it up higher.
How's that?
There we go.
Okay. So a lot of people, when they think of a groundwater basin, they think of a big bathtub, right? And so if you have a little faucet, you put more in and groundwater levels rise overall or they fall overall, right?
Mike.
Oh boy, okay, sorry. And here you have a really, really, really complex system. So if you want to stay at the 50,000 foot level, great. But in this valley, you have those aquitards that I saw. And even that is a huge simplification of what we see in the subsurface.
And an aquitard is what?
An area of high clay content. So water moves easily through larger grains like sand. If you picture a bowl of granola, that's your groundwater basin there. You can pour the milk on, you'll see it rise. If you have grape nuts or you grind up that granola into a flour and put it in there, it doesn't move as easily through those finer particles, right? And so in aquitard, you have an area that has a lot of clay that's really preventing groundwater movement or mostly preventing groundwater movement through it. Maybe it's a really, really, really slow process. So we have aquitards, but we also just see, okay, well, there's not a continuous aquitard, but we have a little bit of clay over here, a little clay over here, a little clay over there. That really muddies how the aquifer system works. And so it's both complex on a large scale, but then also on individual parts of the valley as well.
Is on the maps that we have the darker brown Is that reflecting? I can't see what the
Yeah,
labeling
these
says,
are the
but those
main
are reflecting the
aquatards.
aquatards.
Yeah, so this is one of the reasons that recharge along the coast is really tricky, is that we have a big aquatard very near the surface. So if you had a recharge basin, put a bunch of water in it, it's not going to make it down to the aquifer that you're using, right? So this...
Repeat the
Yeah.
question if you could, please, Abby.
Where are Chular and Gonzales? So this little horseshoe is Somavia Road, is in there. So that would make Chular just slightly past it, Gonzales down here. The aquatard thins out down by those. So, and then it's unconfined, which means you don't have that overlying aquatard. So what we're seeing is you get recharge from the river down as you're in King City, Gonzales, Soledad, but then you're not getting that closer to the coast.
Next question. How should environmental water be quantified?
Good question. It's challenging. It's very challenging. So we have a couple work streams in place. We have surface water, groundwater models started by the Monterey County Water Resources Agency and the County of Monterey. They funded USGS to make a model, and then we have a more specific one that also does seawater intrusion. Those models are basically lots of little teeny tiny squares, and a computer computes in each teeny tiny square how much water is going in each side of that square and out of each side of the square, and it runs it all together. Through that, and you base the models on actual information. So you say, okay, we know we have these groundwater levels at these points, we know we have this pumping, this land use, whatnot, and it kind of does a best fit between those. We can use that to look at where groundwater and surface water is interconnected, or even how much plants can depend on the groundwater, which in part has to do with the groundwater levels. So that's one tool that we have. So in the groundwater sustainability plans, it looks at where are those areas of interconnection. There's also a whole work stream going on in terms of groundwater dependent ecosystems, so that ecosystems that are dependent on groundwater. And the Central Coast Wetlands Group is going out and doing field verification of certain sites. So looking at, okay, are we seeing oaks, which tend to have or can have roots down to even 80 feet below surface, or what are we actually seeing there? There's also satellite data, and we tend to want to use all these tools together in a complementary manner. Satellite data can look at the vegetation as well, so it's a more economically efficient way that we can monitor over time if you have some ground truthing on the ground. The quantification side is really hard. The groundwater model is the best if you want to know actually how much is being taken up. The groundwater model is the main tool that can give you a number for that. But it's best when paired with those other observed data.
All right, thank you for the questions. I want to go ahead and move us along. Oh, wait, we've got one more question. I'm sorry, thank you. Okay. Oh, okay, all right, thank you, Tony. I'll come back to you in a second. What is the process for integrating these two requirements? Deciding the big ticket matters? Am I saying that right? Matters? Okay. And deciding the financing requirements. So what is the process for integrating these two requirements? Deciding the big ticket matters and deciding the financing requirements.
So it's still to come. We're going to figure it out. Somehow it is hard to compare fruits and vegetables that are not the same. So like demand management and seawater intrusion, extraction barrier, how do you really put them? What's the financial ROI from each of those? We're going to do our best. I think we're going to start with a MOVA, just stars. When you go to look at which restaurant is better, you don't necessarily get the dollar amount. You get, is it $4 or is it $2? So I think that's the first thing we're going to go through. The benefit is this much, and the cost is this much versus the benefit is smaller. So relationship between those, I think we're going to first start with that and try to whittle down and narrow down with a long list of PMAs that we have. And then it's a very specific to the beneficial users, the people that are going to benefit from that specific project or action. They're going to decide, and sometimes it's not just financial. Sometimes it's something else for them that is important to that group of people or that region, is what works for them, what is applicable to them. And that's why we have those sub-basin implementation committees that they're going to be sitting down and helping us, the staff, to make those decisions, which one to pick. And sometimes it's money, sometimes it's money plus.
Yeah, can you describe the areas of subsidence, and is that a major concern for our area? I know like in the Westlands Water District, that's obviously a major concern there, but how does it look in our area?
Sure. So there has not been subsidence seen to date in the Salinas Valley.
It has not.
There has not been. So that's the good news. The bad news is that there is the potential for subsidence. And with subsidence, you don't know whether you will have it until you see it, right? It occurs in the lower aquifers first, and then it kind of ripples up to the surface where the land surface comes down. So there's no way of really knowing, is it going to happen? Is it not? There are places that are not that susceptible to subsidence. The way their sediments are together wouldn't really subside. But you do have clay. So when you see thick clay bodies, and that's where you tend to see subsidence, right? Because what's happening is you're depressurizing or dewatering those clays, and then those clays are compacting together, compacting such that they're not going to come back up ever, right? As we saw in the Central Valley, right? And so down here in particular, in the upper aquifers, in part as we've lowered groundwater levels, seawater has come in, right? But this clay body in particular, between the 400 and the deep, it's less of like a really thick, hard aquitard that water doesn't penetrate through. It's more of just a higher prevalence of clay over a large area. And so as we are lowering the groundwater levels on both sides of the clay, but especially in the deep aquifers, there's the potential to dewater those clays or depressurize those clays and then have land subsidence. And as I mentioned, it's a really messy basin, especially as you get down here. There's actually lots of little mini aquitards or clay lenses down there. So it's not just one area of concern, it's all of those. So.
Any other questions before we move on? Let me bring the mic to you.
How come the agriculture people, and I love vegetables, okay, but it's a shared resource. How come they're putting wells 900 feet down in the ancient aquifers? We don't know if they'll ever recharge. We need to work together. What I've heard from farmers, well, I think Salinas should just have a desalination plant. You use the water that way because, we want all the aquifer water. Well, I never got the memo that God gave all that water to agriculture. And what amazed me was that agriculture even sends their crops to Saudi Arabia and other areas, which I didn't know. So we're using up all this water. We need it as a shared resource. How do we get people to work together? And remember, when you're going into these aquifers, like the poor little farmers, just those small agriculture people, their wells are going dry. Any idea how anybody can work together?
That was the reason that the GSAs were created, that SIGMA was enacted, that people were actually quite ignorant on how much they may impact a neighbor or somebody down the road. Yes, it's a shared resource, but we don't really think about it this way. I think there is just more of it's a business reason that people do what they do. It's an economic powerhouse for us. It's not just that farmer, and it impacts all of us. If somebody goes out of business, it impacts all of us. Norm is gonna talk here momentarily about how much ag has actually done to be efficient water user. But how can we do better? That's why this agency is here. We need to have good data first. We need to understand what we have and where we need to, our budget, water budget, I'm comparing it to a financial budget. There is like your personal one. You have income and you have expenses, and you need to be looking at both sides. Do I need to increase do I need to get a second job, or do I need to maybe tighten my belt and use less of it? So it's a very much of a first having good data that we can share with everyone so people understand that what we have and where we need to use less or make more.